Alrighty, so y'all can see that we will be discussing the Pacific theater of World War II, specifically the geography of it. So first I'll discuss the objective for today. So students will be able to understand the island hopping strategy used by the Allied forces in the Pacific to combat the Japanese. So this island hopping strategy was essential to the Pacific theater of the war in Europe and the European theater. The forces were mostly fighting on land on a continent with aircraft and naval support to get onto that land. But in the Pacific, it was much different, as we can see by this map where I'm illustrating where many of these battles and conflicts took place. So we have Japan right here, and then we have the US over here. And as you can see, there is a lot of water with a lot of islands, but there is a lot of water. This isn't a battle which is stretching across a continent. So, our first destination on this map is, of course, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack occurred on December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese attacked the naval base and the airfields there. If Japan would have succeeded in completely decimating this port and harbor for the naval fleet out in the Pacific, they would have been back at the coast, the west coast of the US. As you can see, Hawaii is a big jump start into the Pacific. And without that, the US would have been on a much longer defensive. So, 20 ships were damaged and more than 300 aircraft were damaged in Hawaii. And about 2,400 people were killed and another 1,000 were killed. So, as the Pearl Harbor attack was occurring, there was another attack in the Philippines, which also started on December 7th, 1941 and ended May 10th, 1942. So Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the Philippines, and he loses them to the Japanese invasion there. And since that defeat, MacArthur has wanted to go back. He wanted to reclaim the Philippine Islands after this. As we can see why Japan wanted the Philippines out of US control. They're very close geographically to Japan, kind of like how Hawaii is pretty close to the US. So the next destination is the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was from May 4th, 1942 to May 8th, 1942. And this battle was important because it was the first aircraft carrier to aircraft carrier battle. And then the US felt like they won this battle because the Japanese turned back and did not attack Australia, whereas the Japanese felt like they won because the USS Lexington was sunk there. Now, this isn't the USS Lexington in Corpus, this was the USS Lexington before that one. So our next stop is the turning point of the war, which is the Battle of Midway, which was from June 4th, 1942 to June 7th, 1942. So this, as I said, was the turning point of the war, and we can see why the Japanese wanted it. It is very close right here to Hawaii for another attack, and it's kind of the midway point between Japan and the US. So this is considered the turning point because from this point on the US is on the offensive and Japan is on the defensive. And that's for a very important reason. So Japan lost 3,000 men, 300 aircraft, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 aircraft carriers, where the U.S. lost 360 men, 145 aircraft, and the USS Yorktown, which was another aircraft carrier and a destroyer. So at this point, the U.S. has lost 2 aircraft carriers and Japan has lost 4. Okay, so our next destination is the first offensive, which is the Battle of Guadalcanal, which was from August 7th, 1942 to February 9th, 1943. And then our second major offensive is in the Marshall Islands with the Battle of Tarawa from November 20th, 1943 to November 23rd, 1943. And from here, MacArthur gets his wish and he is going back to the Philippines with the Battle of Leyte, beginning this conflict or taking back the Philippines from October 14th, 1944 to December 31st, 1944. And then the Battle of Luzon was the end. Well, the final stretch, not truly the end. So, which was because even after that July 4th date, there was still more resistance and more fighting that occurred there. So this campaign in the Philippines with taking it back began in October of 1944 and didn't end until July 1945. It's a long time to take back these islands, but they were very important because this gave the U.S. a staging point to go to Iwo Jima, which occurred from February 19, 1945 to March 26, 1945. And this is known as the most brutal battle in the Pacific. Only about 216 Japanese soldiers were not killed or did not commit suicide in this battle. There was a huge loss of life. And from Iwo Jima, the U.S. goes to the Battle of Okinawa, which was from April 1st, 1945 to June 15th, 1945. And about 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed and 50,000 U.S. soldiers were killed. And we can see why these two islands were very important. So Iwo Jima, very close to Japan. Okinawa, very close to Japan. From both of these islands, the U.S. could have performed an invasion of the Japanese mainland. And that's why it was extremely important to gain these two places, as well as the Philippines to act as a staging place for the U.S. to attack them. So, kind of recap now. We started over here in Hawaii with the Battle of Pearl Harbor. Then we go to the Philippines, where MacArthur lost the Philippines to the Japanese. Then we're at the Battle of Coral Sea, where the USS Lexington was sunk. And then our turning point of the war, the Battle of Midway. From the Battle of Midway, it was our first offensive, the Battle of Guadalcanal. And then our second offensive with the Battle of Tarawa. Then we go back to the Philippines and MacArthur gets his wish. And they take back the Philippines with the Battle of Leyte and the Battle of Luzon. From there, we go to the Battle of Iwo Jima and then the Battle of Okinawa. Now, why was there no invasion of Japan? Well, that was because we dropped two atomic bombs. The first was on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the bomb's name was Little Boy. Then Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. So, we go from December 1941 to August of 1945. Okay, so one more recap of the Pacific Island hopping campaign. We're in Hawaii with Pearl Harbor. And then at the same time, MacArthur loses the Philippines, the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Leyte and Luzon, and the Philippines are retaken. And then we are at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and then the two atomic bombs are dropped on Japan. So, in conclusion, the Pacific theater of World War II ended on August 15, 1945 with the surrender of the Japanese to the Allies. While it was the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that led to the eventual surrender, it was the island hopping campaign that allowed the Allies to even get close enough to threaten the Japanese mainland and give them that ability to drop those atomic bombs. Without that, we never would have ended the war. Again, here is that map. You can see just how widespread this war was and how much water was needing to be crossed to reach Japan after it